Hello everyone. How much does a person cost? The question seems to be completely incorrect, unacceptable for a civilized society. After all, human life is priceless. Every member of society has the right to life, freedom and personal inviolability, as we are assured by the 3rd article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But come, leave this intellectual coquetry. In fact, we live in a market era. This means that everything around us is a commodity, including human life, which, by the way, is now being sold at a very budget price, $400 each, okay? And if you take it in bulk, you can bargain for 100. And this is not a quote from a feature film about the Middle Ages. We are talking about our modern times, in which the slave trade has reached such proportions that the richest planters of the Confederacy of the Southern States would envy them. Slavery originated in human society at the stage of the collapse of the primitive communal system, somewhere in the 3rd millennium BC. Primitive people did not know slavery, at least in our usual ancient sense of the word. And the point here, of course, not in their kindness or high moral level, but in the fact that it simply did not make sense to own a slave. Labor productivity was very low, the volume of production was unstable, there was no so-called economic surplus. That is, the primitive worker, relatively speaking, ate everything that he could gather or catch in a day, and when there was no luck with hunting, the tribesmen shared their prey, not allowing them to die of hunger. It is clear that in such conditions there would be simply nothing to take from a slave. However, as the tools of labor improved and productivity increased, the economic surplus began to grow. In order to alienate it and thereby accumulate private property, society turned to the institution of exploitation of man by man. Slavery became historically the first and most brutal form of it. It formed the basis of the ancient mode of production, which replaced the era of primitiveness. The foundation of production relations in that system was the private ownership of the slave, as for the other tools of labor. Of course, the slave had no rights, had no economic incentive to work, and worked only under direct, non-economic compulsion, that is, from under the whiplash. The first sources of slave power were foreigners captured during war, raids or piracy. Later, members of their own tribe were also turned into slaves, for example, for non-payment of debts, for crimes committed, etc. The initial form of slavery was so-called patriarchal slavery, when slaves entered the family that owned them as its members without rights. They usually lived under the same roof with the owner, while doing harder work than the rest of the family. Patriarchal slavery existed to different extents among all the peoples of the world during their transition to a class society, and its economic basis was a natural economy. However, the development of market relations in the ancient economy of ancient Greece and Rome, the transition from production for personal consumption to production for sale, contributed to the transformation of slavery from patriarchal to antique. This is a classic form of slavery that we know from fiction. It was characterized by expropriation of the slave's personality to the most extent. The rise of classical slavery was relatively short-lived, since in the very nature of slave labor there were the reasons for its inevitable decline and degeneration. The slaves' hatred of their work, oppression, which led to endless revolts, as well as a gradual reduction in the influx of slaves, could not but lead to inefficiency of this economic activity. This prompted slave owners to seek new forms of exploitation. It became obvious that it was necessary to somehow interest the direct producer, slave, in his work, and thereby increase the efficiency of exploitation. Many slaves were attached to the land and gradually merged with the colony, dependent peasants of the late Roman Empire and Byzantium. By the 13th century, slavery virtually disappeared here, with the exception of some Mediterranean cities. The slave trade revival took place in the 16th century. It was associated with the colonial enslavement of Asia, Africa and America in the era of the primitive accumulation of capital, or the birth of capitalism. Slavery gained breadth and the greatest economic importance in the colonies on the American continent. This was due to the peculiarities of colonies' development in America, the lack of labor and the availability of free land, in large part suitable for large-scale plantation farming. The resistance from the Indians, as well as their extinction, along with the formal prohibition by the kings of Spain and Portugal to turn Indians into slaves, led to the fact that Spanish and Portuguese, and then North American planters, began to import slaves from Africa. In total, in the period from the beginning of the 16th to the end of the 19th century, the scope of the transatlantic slave trade exceeded 12.5 million people. As capitalist relations developed, the low productivity of slave labor, which hindered the further development of the productive forces, became increasingly clear. In this context, under the pressure of growing resistance from slaves and the development of progressive social movements, a gradual abandonment of slavery began. The Great French Revolution proclaimed the prohibition of the slave trade. However, in the French colonies, this act was implemented, in fact, only half a century later, in the 60s. In the 19th century, slavery was abolished by most of the states of the American continent. Mauritania was the last to abolish slavery in 1981. However, in fact, slavery is still there and is hereditary. International legal regulation of the struggle against slavery began in the 19th century. However, the most of the documents condemning slavery were formal. In fact, the first international convention against slavery was a convention concluded only in 1926 in Geneva, within the framework of the League of Nations. This was followed by the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the Geneva Conference in 1956. It abolished slavery, the slave trade and similar institutions and customs. However, all these proclamations, treaties, conventions and laws have no meaning. After all, we are talking about money-making business, the profitability of which ensures a constantly high demand for slaves. In total, according to the authors of the report Global Slavery Index in 2018, there were more than 40 million slaves in the world, or one slave for every 200 inhabitants of the planet. So, for comparison, this is more than 3 times the volume of the total transatlantic slave trade for the period from the 16th to the 19th century. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights identifies several forms of modern slavery. The first is debt bondage, half of all cases of slavery. This is one of the most common ways of enslaving people, when a person is held as security for a loan provided. The work of a bonded laborer is a means of repaying the loan. Since the work of such laborers is not paid or is very cheap, it is impossible to repay the debt. As a result, debt bondage is often passed on from generation to generation. The second form is serfdom. It is a form of slave labor, in which, by law or custom, a person is obliged to cultivate land belonging to another. And the employee does not have the opportunity to change his serf status. Serfdom is often hereditary and can affect entire families for generations. The third form of slavery is forced labor. It is associated with coercion, violence, threats, intimidation and imprisonment in order to force one person to work against his will for the benefit of another. According to the International Labour Organization, the share of forced labor in the shadow sector of the economy is constantly increasing and is not reflected in national statistics. The fourth form is child labor and child slavery. Every fourth slave on the planet is a child. Forced labor of 10 million children is used in hard and harmful work in agriculture, mining industry, armed groups and the production of pornography. Finally, the fifth form is sexual slavery. It is expressed in forced prostitution and also in forced marriage, sale or inheritance of wives. By the way, more than 70% of the 40 million slaves are women, 15 million of whom are married against their will. Of the 25 million people involved in forced labor, the majority, 16 million, work in the private sector. Slaves clean houses and apartments, produce clothes, collect fruits and vegetables, extract shrimp for restaurants and natural resources, from which they produce smartphones, cosmetics and electric cars. 5 million people involved in forced labor are sexually exploited, and more than 4 million are enslaved by the state. This form of slavery is associated with the abuse of army recruitment and use of prison labor. Slave labor of migrants is actively used in the construction of facilities for the World Cup, which will be held in Qatar in 2022. According to the estimates of the newspaper The Guardian, more than 6,500 workers who build stadiums, hotels and airports have died on Qatari construction sites. The newspaper is based on data received from the embassies in Qatar of 5 countries, many of whose citizens worked at local construction sites. Most of all the Indians died, 2,700 people. Another 1,600 from Nepal, 1,000 from Bangladesh, more than 800 from Pakistan, and more than 550 from Sri Lanka. The people have to work in severe conditions. There are no labor protection standards at construction sites. The workers are forced to live in poor sanitation. Wages are paid with long delays and not in full. And most importantly, the worker does not have the opportunity to quit, move to another job or go home. From the very beginning, the documents are taken away from the workers, turning them into real serfs. The Nepalis do not have a powerful state behind them, like the Indians. They are not united with the Qataris by a common faith, like the citizens of Pakistan and Bangladesh. And the Nepalis are becoming victims of widespread deception in Qatar. Even at home, employees are recruited by special officers associated with future employers. Construction companies do not hire a person directly, because then it is easy to avoid responsibility when a claim arises. The kafala legal system operating in Qatar and other countries of the Persian Gulf completely frees the hands of business. The employer is responsible to the state for the status of a migrant, is a guarantor for issuing a visa, and guarantees all expenses during his stay in the country. In return, the state turns a blind eye to the true situation and the rights of the employee. In addition to construction, the leading industry in the use of bonded labor is fishing. A 2017 study found that between 2011 and 2016, 3/4 of migrant workers in the fishing industry in Thailand were in debt bondage. And every third worker was literally bought from slave traders like cattle. The situation is aggravated by a number of factors. Recent years have seen a significant increase in the demand for fish and seafood. Growing competition against the background of a falling catch per unit leads to a decrease in profits. In addition, most of the seafood market operates on the principle of monopsony, when one large wholesale company buys fish from hundreds and thousands of small firms that own 1 to 2 boats, and, of course, artificially lowers purchase prices. Taken together, this leads to the fact that it is the small business in the fishing industry that plays the role of the most ruthless exploiter. Wanting to reduce costs, it does not hesitate to use slave labor. Fishermen who escaped from such boats told the press about their appalling working conditions, including 20-hour shifts, regular beatings, torture, and public executions. Some fishermen had been at sea for years. Raw materials extracted by slaves are an important resource for a multi-billion-dollar business. The world's largest shrimp company, CP Foods, is also located in Thailand. Its annual turnover exceeds $33 billion. As a feed for shrimp, it uses fish flour, which is produced from the rejected catch of the very fishing vessels that actively use slave labor. The manufactured products are sold through the largest retail chains, which also receive their share of profits from the labor of slaves. Statistically, modern slavery is most common in Africa, especially in the form of forced marriages. It is followed by Asia and the Pacific region. 70% of victims of sexual exploitation live here. It may seem that slavery is the lot of backward poor regions, but there is not a single country that would not be tainted by this shameful phenomenon. 1.5 million slaves live in the countries of the center of the world's capitalism. For example, over 400,000 in the USA, 136,000 in the UK, 167,000 in Germany. At the same time, the authors of the Global Slavery Index note the estimate of 40 million slaves is conservative. Most likely, there are much more slaves in the modern world. Due to language barriers or the escalation of armed conflicts, tens of millions of people and entire regions were not covered by the study. Slavery is a big and very profitable business. In the Middle Ages, slave traders were forced to bear large transport costs for the movement of slaves, which was also accompanied by their high mortality. And modern technologies reduce losses to a minimum. A 2014 study by the International Labour Organization shows that globally, slave labor has generated $150 billion in annual profits. Around one-third, $47 billion, is accounted for by developed countries, including the EU. And if we take the profit per slave, then the gentlemen from Western democracies have no equal at all. $35,000 a year is 10 times more than in Africa. Such profit comes primarily from sexual slavery, which services are in great demand in rich countries. Where do slaves come from? The ranks of slaves are replenished from various sources. This may be a peasant from Cambodia, who first looks for a more paid job in a neighboring country, and then finds himself on a fishing boat in the Indian Ocean. Or a young girl who was forced to get married at the age of 13 because her family's fields were flooded due to a natural disaster, and they can no longer afford to keep her at home. Or a homeless man who was abducted from a social canteen in London to work on a construction site. Or a migrant whose visa has expired, and now, under the threat of deportation, he is subordinate to a human trafficker. The UN calls poverty, inequality, hunger, and economic crisis the reason for the growth of the slave trade. In recent decades, the number of armed conflicts in the world has been growing. On the one hand, they increase the demand for slaves, who are used as soldiers and suicide bombers. On the other hand, they expand the supply, filling the slave market with refugees, widows, and orphaned children. As Siddharth Hakara writes in his book Modern Slavery, the excess supply has significantly reduced the price of slave power. If American slaves in 1809 were sold for about $40,000 in modern money, today you can buy a person for begging at a price of $100. Slaves for sexual exploitation are more expensive, $2,000 to $3,000. And the average price of a slave is about $450, cheaper than an old model iPhone. And what about Russia? Researchers of the problem of modern slavery, it is one of the world leaders in the absolute number of slaves. In 2018, there were almost 800,000 of them. In terms of relative indicators of slavery, Russia ranks 64th in the world, with the result of 5.5 slaves per 1,000 inhabitants. This is better than Haiti, but worse than Mozambique. In Russia, mostly migrants are at risk of falling into slavery. However, there are frequent cases of enslavement of lonely people, people from depressed regions, who come to large cities to work. The country has an extensive system of exploitation of people who find themselves in difficult life situations. Drug and alcohol addicted, homeless, people are recruited and sold into slavery under the guise of helping them find work. And the authors of the Global Slavery Index classify Russia as a country with a high risk of enslavement of people engaged in production of seafood. In short, slavery is not a relic of the past at all. Despite the general inefficiency of slave labor, there are many sectors of the economy where the labor under the whiplash remains in demand. The human trade is an extremely profitable business that enriches go-getters from all over the planet, including in respectable Western democracies, who successfully commercialize wars, hunger, inequality and poverty by buying human material at a reasonable price.